Oi oi, it's your boy, the Ignacio Bahamondes of Big Ratio Twitter Respondes, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you following UFC 313. I know I've used that pun before, but how many opportunities do I get when Ignacio Bahamondes is in the news? Triangled Jalen Turner over the weekend, very impressively. But let's not bury the lead. We're talking about Magomed Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira. Big Ank, Wankalaev himself, came out, and this was another Ronda Rousey killing the Queen moment for me here, where I wrote an article about beating Ronda Rousey back in the day, called Killing the Queen, going, oh, there's all these interesting holes that could be exploited. But I don't think her next opponent, Holly Holm, is going to be the one who exploits them. And then Holly Holm did literally everything I wrote in the article. And it was kind of like that with Magomed Ankalaev. I did a Filthy Casuals guide to Alex Pereira in the week where I just picked up on this interesting facet of hand fighting when he was against southpaw opponents. So Izzy went southpaw a few times in their fights and was certainly in their first fight, and was able to shut down his left hook by hand fighting with him. Second fight, Pereira hand fights a lot better, which is one of the interesting things about those two fights. First fight, Izzy looks much better and loses. Second fight, Pereira looks much better and loses. Then he met Jamal Hill and used his own hand fighting to beat the southpaw Jamal Hill. And then he met Khalil Roundtree, and hand fighting was not much of a facet in that fight because Khalil Roundtree, while a southpaw and a right-handed southpaw at that, likes to keep his hands really close and not engage in the hand fight. It still played a role. Pereira was constantly stepping around his lead foot, he likes to hold his hands out like a window. He does this against orthodox opponents too, but to try and make them throw straight through the middle. And against orthodox opponents, he'll clap them with the left hook. But he was just parrying Khalil's lead hand. So I talked about all these interesting facets of the hand fight and how Alex Pereira struggled with it, adapted with it, and then hasn't really seen it that much since, even though he's fought two southpaws in a row before this fight. And then at the end I was like, here's Magomed Ankalaev. He only really hand fights a bit, which is, unusual for a southpaw. He likes to give up the hand fight, let the guy come towards him. He likes to circle back to his left and look to counter them with big right hooks, which is his lead hand, and he likes to drop it low, so he doesn't really engage in the hand fight because he wants you to come to him. And I think I ended it with, and I haven't seen anything from Ankalaev in the hand fight that leads me to believe he'll shut down Pereira's left hook. Lo and behold, comes out, hand fights with Pereira, shuts down his left hook. There's an additional advantage to being a southpaw against a guy with a great left hook. The distance changes. If you stand at hand fighting range and you have your hands touching each other, often you're obstructing the path of his jab. So if he wants to throw his left hook or his lead hand hook, he has to open his hand out away from his body. So you can see that because he's going to leave the space in front of your hand. And then he's got to leap to get to you because you're quite far away, because your lead hands and lead feet are out there in front of you, creating a bigger distance between you. If you're orthodox versus orthodox or southpaw versus southpaw, you just step your lead leg right in, almost like thigh to bollocks, and you can hit them with the left hook very easily. So it's that additional length. If you watch this fight, there's lots of points where Ankalaev's lead hand, his right hand, is on Pereira's lead hand, and Pereira, you're going, why is he not jumping in and throwing the left hook like he did against Jamal Hill? But if you're looking at them, you're going, well, Ankalaev would see that coming a mile away because he's got to free his hand, get it out to the side, and then try and whip it in and leap forward. And Ankalaev will just dip back to the left and run off. If you watch the Jamal Hill fight, Jamal Hill gets wrecked by the left hook as a southpaw because he lets Pereira control his lead hand, and then with his back to the fence, he goes, oh, I'm going to fight my way out of this, throws his left straight. Pereira's still controlling his lead hand, so it comes down in front of his chest, and Pereira can leap forward with the left hook, basically free of charge, and Jamal Hill's opened himself up to it at the same time. Magomed Ankalaev was denying the left hook really well throughout this fight, denying the jab especially well throughout this fight. If you place your lead hand on top of the opponent's lead hand, very hard for him to jab. He's then got the job of freeing himself from the hand fight. Now, something we pointed out in that video, which again, watch it on the YouTube channel, was that when Izzy was losing the hand fight against Pereira, he just throws a hard kick with his rear leg. Body kick, high kick, either works, because you don't need to step any closer. You can just do it straight out of your stance, and it's a nice long weapon. And it sort of tells them, get off me. Because if you lump him in the arm, you can pull your hand back and get free from the hand fight. And Pereira quickly stole this from Izzy and started using it against Izzy in their rematch. And anytime you see him lose the hand fight, this fight's great example, dozens of occasions. He starts losing the hand fight, he throws a right high kick as hard as he can. And it's a problem, because if Ankalaev gets lazy at any point, or his arm gets out of position, he could get domed very easily. So the hand fight was a huge part of this fight, but with Pereira, he's only got a few weapons. It's really interesting comparing his kickboxing days to his MMA days, because his kickboxing days, certainly by the end, he's throwing beautiful combinations, just teeing off on people, 4 or 5 strike combos. But that's kickboxing, where everyone just covers up. That's the main defense. And certainly no one's going to take you down if you fall into a clinch with them. In MMA, he's got maybe 3 or 4 openers. It's the body jab, the leaping left hook, occasionally the regular jab, and then the calf kick, either off his lead leg or his rear leg, depending on their stance. One of the things I pointed out in that Filthy Casuals guide, and I was raving about on the Boycast this week, was that Alex Pereira, just with the calf kick, has done so much damage because when the opponent changes stance, they don't get away from it. He's almost as fast with his step-up lead leg calf kick as he is with his regular calf kick. There are so many guys in the UFC who love the calf kick, and then the moment the opponent changes stances, normally because they've hurt their lead leg, they can't do anymore. So having it off both sides is really important, and in that first round, he really did get to work calf kicking Ankalaev. So Ankalaev constantly had to negotiate the lead hand, the rear leg high kick, which is going to be coming in to punish him whenever he's winning the hand fight, and the step-up calf kick, which, while Pereira doesn't like to throw it when he's losing the hand fight, he can throw it when he's losing the hand fight. So he's doing a tightrope walk there, and trying to keep the pressure up on Pereira at the same time. We talked about how Pereira's calf kick also lands very well because he moves. His upper body is statuesque. He's done so much work to shave off the tells. So he never turns his hips and shoulders over. The only thing his upper body does is that his right hand, his lead hand, throws straight backwards to counterbalance. But everything about that calf kick is sacrificing power and form and defense for getting it in quicker and on target. But conversely, he also hides them in movement a lot, so his upper body stays still, but he bounces around the opponent and leads them onto the calf kick, which is a big part of when he's successful. If you watch him against Jan Blachowicz, who again, very hard for Izzy to calf kick him at all or low kick him at all. There were people calling him the best kick checker in MMA, which was a really weird title. But that was the fight where we were talking about like who landed more feints and shit. So people were in a weird spot striking-wise in MMA, or the fans were. But Pereira likes to bounce around the opponent and lead them onto calf kicks, which is really interesting because from the Izzy fights, I think people, and the Bruno Silva fight, people expect him to be sort of a bully and walking people down. But a lot of his best work has been done sort of bringing the opponent towards him. A great example would be Sean Strickland, who is not anywhere near as dangerous as Pereira as a striker. You're not going to get one punch smoked by Sean Strickland, but it's Pereira who's giving ground the whole time in that fight. He's letting Sean Strickland come onto him and eat these body jabs, these calf kicks, and then the leaping left hook. So Magomed Ankalaev did a really good job, I thought, of constantly moving up to Pereira and staying in his face, because that circling around and correcting distance all the time, that gets tiring. At a certain point in fights, most people he's fighting, or anyone who does that sort of correcting the distance constantly, like Valentina Shevchenko, very different style, but constantly correcting the distance to be just where she wants. If you keep walking up to them, it can get very tiring. McGregor versus Mayweather is a great example. McGregor wants to land that counter left hand sliding back, and for 6 rounds, Mayweather just keeps walking up to him. He doesn't cut the ring on him. He just lets him run around and tire himself out. So that played a part in the fight, it looked like. I really liked the left push kick to the body that Magomed Ankalaev used to physically shove Pereira back towards the cage. Also cuts inside a round kick, so if he threw it at the same time Pereira was throwing a high kick, that would work well too. It's just quite a safe but powerful option if you're constantly walking up to the guy. But we talked about this the other day, like teeping and stuff, when you're chasing someone, can be really stupid. So he was doing it from quite good ring position where Pereira didn't have a lot of space to move back. He'd have to go left or right. And then Ankalaev would slam that lead foot in and push him back into the cage. Sorry, rear foot. First round, I think I did give to Pereira because he was chewing him up with the calf kick. But I think one of the things that we really do underrate is pressure in terms of countering the calf kick. It really is a technique where you want to land on a good spot. You want to land on the back of the leg almost. And if the guy's keeping his leg pointing out and walking towards you all the time, it can really mess up your connections. Look at Holloway versus Gaethje. Holloway gets hit with a ton of those kicks and just isn't affected in the same way. It's not because he's got like a granite shin, or a granite calf rather. It seemed to be that just Gaethje was never getting the really good connections he wanted. Because accuracy is what seems to make the calf kick. That's what makes it so much more valuable than a thigh kick in many respects. And the idea that it doesn't exist in kickboxing, I know, I say this every time, but we're probably having some people in today who haven't followed the podcast. Calf kicking does exist in Muay Thai and in fact has got more popular since getting popular in MMA. It's not the case that like once you're a certain level of good, calf kicks don't work on you. Nongo stopped Liam Harrison with calf kicks. Nongo is a 4-time, I think, Lumpini champion, and Liam Harrison's a British Muay Thai legend. And Nongo managed to... Nongo would show the inside low kick and the teep to the lead leg to get Harrison picking his leg up with the knee pointing towards him. And then he would kick the back of the calf as Harrison picked his leg up. And another example is Yuki Yoza, the great Japanese kickboxer. I think he's the best lightweight in the world at the moment. But he stopped a number of opponents with calf kicks. But he stopped Petchdam, who was a Lumpini champion, with calf kicks. So it's not that it doesn't work if you're good enough and Thai. But the pressure seemed to be doing a lot to complicate Pereira's job. Second round, I think it was Ankalaev gets in the clinch, goes in for a takedown and attempts that. And Pereira defended himself well. This fight is another great example of how takedown, just the presence of the will to take someone down, will change a fight completely. So Ankalaev went 0 for 12 on takedowns. His actual takedown offense or accuracy, whatever you want to call it, in the UFC up to this point was like 30%. But by showing those takedowns, he made stuff happen. He made Pereira's job more complicated. He made Pereira more reluctant to throw. If you saw in the... When was it he backed him onto the fence and hit him with that really good overhand? I think that was the end of the third, maybe. But that was because when Ankalaev showed him the level change, Pereira threw a knee. He did it earlier in the fight after the first attempt at the takedown, and then he did it again later, and he went to throw the knee, pulled it, because Ankalaev was just faking the level change, and then Ankalaev hit him with an overhand. They showed it on replay between the rounds at one point. I can't remember which round it happened in, but it was a pretty important part of the fight. But just that being able to say, if you give me an easy takedown, I will take the easy takedown, showing the willingness that you want to be on top, even if you're not constantly chasing the takedown. We're going to talk about Ray Sarria later and how he just kept diving after the leg. It's like, you could do with attacking the takedown less, obviously. Magomed Ankalaev benefited more from showing that he wanted the takedown than anything he actually did with the wrestling. There was some interesting stuff where Ankalaev changed stances in the fourth. He does change stances. He changed stances against Johnny Walker, knocked him out orthodox, even though he's mainly a southpaw. But it tends to be something he does to mix up his ideas. But in this fight, he was throwing the left straight to the body, stepping through and throwing an orthodox left hook, which was working quite well. I will say I was very surprised. He's always the taller guy in his fights, and he looked smaller than Pereira in this one. Pereira it's been said 1,000 times, but anytime Pereira stands next to anyone, they end up looking smaller. It's absolutely bonkers this man was a middleweight at one point. And there was a really nice moment where Ankalaev backed Pereira onto the cage. Pereira had hand control. Pereira tried to throw his right straight and get off the cage, and Ankalaev clapped him with the counter right hook. It was really interesting because both men are lead hook heavy fighters. Both men love throwing the lead hook as a counter, but Ankalaev sees tons of orthodox fighters. Pereira has had a really... only recently in his career has he started meeting southpaws. Lucas Bourdon, who I trust more on kickboxing details than most people, said he couldn't remember the last southpaw Pereira faced in kickboxing. Switch hitters, yes, he met Israel Adesanya and Vakatov switches, and both of them had success going southpaw against him. But full-time southpaws can't remember the last one he fought. Then in MMA, he's got like Bruno Silva is a sort of switch hitty southpaw. Izzy is a switch hitter. And then it's Jamal Hill, Khalil Roundtree, Ankalaev all back-to-back. How bizarre is that? And it kind of mirrors just... There's a lot more southpaws in MMA generally. I always bring up my Chris Weidman stat. From his fight with Damian Maia in 2012, January 2012, until he met Gegard Mousasi in 2017, Chris Weidman only fought southpaws. And then he fought Gastelum after that and Dominic Reyes. Like, there's a weird number of southpaws, or there were a weird number of southpaws in the top end of middleweight at the time. So there was a lot of disagreement over the scorecards on this because I've just heaped praise on Ankalaev because I thought he did a really good job. And I thought his moments were considerably bigger than Pereira's. But the way that the fights are scored is round by round. And round 1 I gave to Pereira. Round 3, I think Pereira was coming back into it. And round 5 was also largely Pereira. However, I felt like rounds 2 to 5, Ankalaev was doing a lot. Like, if you took those four rounds together, it was all Ankalaev. So yeah, it's down to how you scored individual rounds. It was very funny to see them get a unanimous decision because Sal D'Amato was on the panel. And once you realise that you can bet on the split decision, you start looking at judges askance because they don't get penalised for being the dissenting voice on every card. Not saying Sal D'Amato does this. He could just be the worst judge in the world. I'm leaving that open too. But if you wanted to score split decisions, it would be very easy on cards, on fights that are obviously one way, to score the other. And honestly, Sal D'Amato does that a lot, perhaps by accident. But if you're suddenly watching a competitive fight and you're like, well, how do I make sure there's a split decision? Because if it's competitive, the other two judges could be scoring it either way. So Sal D'Amato went into overdrive and scored the weirdest card of all, which was 4 rounds to 1 for Ankalaev, 49-46. The others got 48-47. People online are doing the Diaz 1-2-5, but they're doing Pereira 1-3-5. And crucially, I think a lot of people hated this fight, and I actually quite enjoyed it. Perhaps I don't typically enjoy Magomed Ankalaev that much. I can definitely understand why people are so pessimistic about this, because Pereira was the UFC's only star. He's the only guy they've got actually drawing in pay-per-view buys, which you should have picked up on when they gave Khalil Roundtree a completely nonsense PED sentence in order to get him back in time for Pereira to fight him, instead of booking this fight originally. Pereira is money. The Chama stuff, the Moe head, the arrow celebration, all that stuff has dripped through into the wider culture. He's actually caught on in quite a big way from our weird little niche sport. I think it was Phil McKenzie I was listening to last week. He was talking about how it's quite nice that, in spite of all that is wrong with MMA, it's quite nice that this still happens, this meritocracy matchup, that if you were a cunning promoter, if this were boxing or something, you would wait for Ankalaev to fight someone else. You'd go, oh, well, probably Ankalaev would have 2 of the world titles and Pereira would have 2 of the world titles. And you go, well, we've got mandatory challengers we've got to fight. You go fight yours and hope that one of those mandatory challengers knocks Ankalaev off. But in this sport, in the UFC, this fight happened later than it should have, but it happened. And they gave up their big star for a guy who is probably not going to be a big star. Ankalaev is frustrating because he doesn't have a lot of urgency in his fights. He's very capable as a counterpuncher. He's a big hitter, and that makes people scared to engage him, which, again, slows down his fights. And then, as a knockout artist, he hasn't really knocked out anyone of note. Johnny Walker and Ion Cutelaba, that's about it. And to be fair, actually, while we're talking about Johnny Walker, 2 of Ankalaev's worst performances have been against Johnny Walker and Jan Blachowicz, who both just circled and threw low kicks. So this was a bad stylistic matchup for him in some respects. As much as his ability as a southpaw boxer made him a bad matchup for Pereira, and also the wrestling too. But he had to face some of his big, weak areas to win this fight. Or he didn't, depending on how you feel about it. But I'm just giving you my view. They're saying they're going to do the rematch immediately, but honestly, I think you could do Pereira in a fairly safe fight on a fight night, and just actually where they go somewhere and sell some tickets, get some attention on it. This is a fight that you could do a slightly slower build on, because Ankalaev fights twice a year. You don't need to rush him. Pereira does like fighting more, and if you put him in against someone feckless like Ion Cutelaba, who's just won a fight, so you could probably argue like, oh yeah, that's a totally reasonable fight, and he's got history with Ankalaev. Easy win for Pereira, easy knockout. Everyone's a winner, in the words of Hot Chocolate, except Ion Cutelaba. On the subject of activity, that is something that Pereira will probably want to consider, though. He did 3 fights in 2023, 3 fights in 2024, and he actually had a 6-month break before this one, which is probably the longest he's had in a while. When you are a champion and when you are a star, those are the times to leverage that and fight less. But he wasn't doing that. And it's not just that, like, you could say that, he didn't really get hit that much against Yuri or Jamal Hill or even Roundtree, to be honest. But he is getting hit in training because he's training for real fights. And that's what takes it out of people. Certainly peaking the body over and over again like that will take it out of people. So, yeah, he could probably do with some time off. Let Ankalaev do a Abu Dhabi card or something. What else we got? I didn't even mention at the start of the show. This card, I thought it was all right, but it's rare that you have a card where there's like 3 moments where you go, that's some of the coolest shit I've ever seen. And for me, that happened with Gaethje's counter uppercut, Ray Saruya's over-the-shoulder throw, and Mauricio Rufi's awesome wheel kick. So can't complain in terms of highlights. There's a lot to remember from this card. But Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev, this one was booked at short notice, of course, because Hooker broke his hand on someone's forehead. Like I said, you can't complain about that because they're never clearing you with a broken hand already. But Fiziev stepped up to this fight, coming off a more than a year layoff after injuring his knee against Gamrot. He hadn't won a fight since he lost that first fight to Gaethje back in March 2023. It was a close competitive fight. This one was a lot of fun. It was methodical Gaethje. Honestly, this fight, I bring everything back to Roberto Duran because I think he's the best fighter ever and story in boxing. But Roberto Duran had this like God-given power. He was Manos de Piedra, Fists of Stone, at lightweight. But a lot of his career happened well after his prime, after he went up to welterweight and started just eating his way through the rankings. His biggest win, probably, the first one over Sugar Ray Leonard, happened after his prime, after he'd left the lightweight division where he'd been reigning for like 8 years at that point or something. But he went up, and the thing that people said was he just doesn't hit as hard when he's fighting welterweights, when he's fighting middleweights. And he got craftier and craftier. And he had these big moments where he like dropped around Barkley and people like that. He still hurt people, but that power wasn't so incredible anymore. But he picked up a load of smart stuff as well. If you watch how he learned to use his jab to get in and do two-handed hitting, so much stuff in there. And I thought about that with Justin Gaethje in this fight because he has some of the heaviest hands at lightweight naturally. He always did. If you watch his WSOF fights, he's just clubbing people with the clumsiest right hooks you've ever seen, and he's dropping them on their face. But Trevor Whitman has really, as a coach, you don't get to work that closely with that many fighters. So his work with Justin Gaethje really does reflect, it's going to be his legacy, really does reflect well on him. And Gaethje's jab looked good in the first fight, but we all joked about how he'll just forget it. He won't bring it back because he's a dummy. But he really, from the get-go, he was coming out and he was using this beautiful, long, springing jab like a fencer's lunge. He was coming in across the cage, hitting Fiziev on the snoot and then trying to hit him with an uppercut afterwards. The duck-down head kick he threw out of the clinch, crazy. That high kick he knocked out Poirier with. Just all these little tricks that Whitman has been banging on at him about in training for years, and then he just hasn't used them until now. It's really nice watching him sort of come into his own as not just a massive hitter, but a very good technician and massive hitter. And then what I liked from Fiziev was that he came out and he immediately tried to take Justin Gaethje down. And Gaethje was he Div 1 All-American? He's very accomplished as a wrestler, but he doesn't look for takedowns, and he says it tires him out to pursue takedowns. I think in the first Fiziev fight, he does a tactical takedown attempt at some point in the third round. But something you'd notice in his fights with Eddie Alvarez and the first one with Poirier, both of those guys in maybe round 3 duck in for a takedown, and they go for it. They give it the beans. They knock Gaethje down, or take him down, but he explodes up to his feet, like he did in this one. He creates a beautiful scramble, explodes up to his feet, and then they separate, and he's like breathing out his arse. And it always stuck with me because both those guys used bodywork and tired Gaethje out. But those takedown attempts from both of them did a lot of the work too. This is a man who admits he doesn't wrestle in fights because it tires him out. So why not? But Fiziev took him down in the first round off a low kick, which I didn't like, Gaethje just coming out with naked low kicks. But he took him down off a low kick. And they ended up in half guard, and Gaethje did something very interesting. He put his hands in both of Fiziev's armpits and used the trapped leg in half guard to kick him up overhead and just scrambled up. It was really weird to watch, and I thought, I'm going to try and steal that, and it's not going to work because I'm not Justin Gaethje. But it was very interesting to watch that. And then every other time that Fiziev grabbed his leg, he immediately turned away and somersaulted, which is such a eccentric form of, like, people in wrestling. They always talk about lines of defense and how you don't want to overcommit. You know, you let him go through the lines of defense. You don't want to be. It's kind of like boxing too. You don't want to be swinging wildly out of the way of every punch. You want to try and do smaller movements that cost you less energy and are a bit safer. But the turn and somersault is cool. But Gaethje's always had this interesting thing where it's kind of like a jab and dip, but he dips his head to his right side and smushes his face towards the opponent's chest. Whenever they throw punches, he dips down to his right and he puts his head towards their chest. And if you watch his fight with Michael Johnson, he butted Johnson when Johnson was coming in for a takedown attempt. He's always like ducking his head like that. And what he does is he throws his left arm out as he does so. And sometimes he gets like an underhook, sometimes he grabs the back of their head, and then he just comes back and throws his right hand to where his hand is, to where his other hand is. And he's been doing this since like the World Series of Fighting days, knocking people out with right hands while he's holding them behind the head. So it's really interesting how he gets there. In open exchanges, he slaps them with his hand as he's ducking into their chest, and then he pulls back and clubs them with the uppercut or the right hook. And Fiziev read that because he's now had 6 rounds with Gaethje, and he was trying to exploit it with his own uppercut and with a left knee, a stepping left knee. He also did some stuff from southpaw, so he was just left knee from there too. But as soon as that left knee came up and threatened Gaethje, he did something very clever, and I think it was clever. I never like to say someone did something because something. I know, because I don't live inside people's heads. I can't see why they did something. I can tell you why something worked. I know there's lots of occasions where guys have lucked into the right thing for a particular opponent's habits and style. But every single time in this fight that Gaethje engaged, he ducked his head down to the right. The moment he almost got hit by that left knee, he enters by ducking to his left. And Fiziev tries to follow him with an uppercut, misses, and Gaethje weaves all the way under to his right and comes in, gets the collar tie, uppercuts him, looks like he's made him bite his tongue in half and knocks him down. And it's the only time I think I've ever seen Gaethje slip to his left before he steps in. So I suspect he saw something there. But that slip, grab, and uppercut, slip, grab, and right hook, it's beautiful. And he was doing some great work from the clinch in this fight because Fiziev is very good from the clinch himself. It was him and Piotr Yan were sort of leading the charge on clinch striking in MMA. But I've always said I wish Gaethje would use his clinch more offensively because he loves holding the collar tie and hitting the uppercut. He's got decent knees from there. He's got good elbows, and he's strong. Now, granted, it is a form of wrestling, and he said that he doesn't like wrestling because it makes him tired in fights. But he's getting on in this division. It would be really cool to see him sort of adopt the Randy Couture strategy of just trying to stick to people and beat them up that way. See if it works at lightweight. Certainly with his jab and dip, he can enter well. He's got the nice tools out on the feet, out in the open. He doesn't have particularly long exchanges out in the open. It tends to be when he does his little chest-to-chest bump thing that he's able to land a couple more punches. But I thought this was a really good fight. And I think this was a lot more convincing for Gaethje. I still saw some people saying that Fiziev was robbed, but it was a really good fight. I will say that when Buffer says the former BMF champion, Gaethje looks so unimpressed. That whole thing. So cringe, but at least we got some cool fights out of it. You could have just made the cool fights in the first place, but gotta have them belts on those pay-per-views. Man, I've gone like half an hour just rapping about 2 fights. Ruffy versus Bobby Green, King Green. Shit, I keep forgetting his name's King. He changed his name and then he got left unconscious twice in a row. This one, there wasn't an awful lot going on here. What I liked was that Green was standing southpaw, Ruffy was standing orthodox. He showed that stuff about hand fighting we talked about with Louis Kane in the Filthy Casuals Guide to Alex Pereira. Sort of backhands a jab against Green's lead hand to make him stop it. Then he whips his hand around outside like a loose left hook to strip that hand down and throw his right hand. Something that Vladimir Klitschko used to be amazing at. He did it to Joshua and stunned him. He'd backhand the jab in so that he could then whip it round the other way and strip the hand from the inside. That was orthodox versus orthodox, but it's sort of like fencing. You know, you're crossing swords and then you flick it round the other side. But the wheel kick was incredible. This was a combination I've talked about. I think I did it in an old Fightland piece about Street Fighter or something. It's one of the little set combo things that Ryu had on, was it Third Strike? But left hook, right wheel kick. Frankie Edgar did it for real in a fight, but Frankie Edgar, you know, in the words of someone I saw online talking about Sean Shirk, his arms are shorter than his dick. The problem with the technique is that the left hook is so much shorter than the wheel kick that you're going to really struggle to get them in range where, unless they lean back from your left hook and you can see him doing it, it's very difficult to do. But when Mauricio Ruffi threw his long slappy left hand, Bobby Green leaned back and he was still there for the wheel kick and the heel hit him right in the head. You know, a lot of the time you get these slappy ones, but that was heel to head and Bobby Green just face planted. It was brutal. Bobby Green should probably retire, but man, what a highlight. And the fighting nerds, I said I love them, but then people jump out of the woodwork to go, they've not fought anyone good yet. I mean, John Silver beat Drew Dober. Granted, it was short notice, and did he miss weight? I can't remember, but yeah, that's a good opponent. And Caio Borralho just walked through Jared Cannonier. I'm not saying they're the best fighters in the world. I'm not saying this is the next Team Eagle. I'm just saying that they've got a lot of fun, talented fighters coming out of there. Oh my God, the women's fight. This was the fun women's division, the good women's division. Amanda Lemos and Yasmin Lucindo, absolute trash fight. And I saw people blaming Lucindo. Both of them had significant time on top and did nothing with it. The entirety of the damage in this fight on either fighter was done by Lemos missing a punch and accidentally clipping her with her elbow. And God bless Joe Rogan for trying to spin that. He's going, that's the kind of power she has. Throwback to Fedor Emelianenko's first loss, and for a long time only loss. He fought Tsuyoshi Kosaka, and Kosaka missed a punch and accidentally sliced him open with his elbow, because Fedor had paper-thin, snow-white skin. That was always the weakness he was born with. He was amazing at everything else, but you could cut him with a sideways look. And TK's elbow brushes along the side of Fedor's face, opens up a cut. They have to have one guy go on because it's a tournament. And I think it was the same night even, so they had to have someone win. So they go TK wins by TKO, but elbows were illegal in rings. So it stuck in everyone's craw for a long time, and then they did a rematch in Pride, and Fedor almost beat him to death. Because in rings, he wasn't allowed to hit people on the ground. That was the rule. You couldn't hit the face on the ground. And then he came to Pride, and we went, oh my God, this guy's the best ground and pounder who ever lived. Bit of history for you there, but go check out that first fight, because it was the same thing. Missed right hand, elbow opens him up. And that fight went something like 16 seconds, and the same amount of damage was done as in this 15-minute fight between Lemos and Lucindo. Ignacio Bahamondes hit a beautiful triangle on Jalen Turner. This one was sad because Jalen Turner retired afterwards. I believe he's 29. I imagine he's run down and disappointed. He's had some bad calls in his against him. Or not even bad calls, like fights that could have gone either way against good opponents. Guys who are in the top 10 now. So he had Gamrot and Dan Hooker back-to-back. Both those fights he could have won very reasonably, and people would argue the other way, but it'd be exactly the same. Then he knocked out Bobby Green in one of the most brutal stoppages in MMA history. Tries to do a walk-off knockout on Moicano, probably because he had PTSD from knocking out Bobby Green in such a horrible fashion and having to hit him like 100 times on the ground. But Moicano gets up and beats him. And now he's just lost this second one in a row to Bahamondes. So on paper, it's 1-4 in his last 5, going back to 2022. We all know he's much better than that. But at the end of the day, he's losing half his purse every time. It doesn't matter if you had a great fight against a great fight. This is what always impresses me about a lot of fighters. Being able to applaud your opponent and say, well done and stuff, while not thinking about the fact that you've just lost half the money that you were going to be getting. It's very strong character to be able to just swallow that down and congratulate the other guy. But, he's doing full training camps every time. He's training for the best in the world. It's going to be bloody disappointing to be losing these. I imagine he'll take like a year off and then come back. I hope so, because he's really good. If you watch his fight with Bobby Green, Ruffy just sort of overwhelmed him here. Paddy Pimblett kicked him in the leg. Actually, Paddy Pimblett's game plan against Bobby Green was really good. But Jalen Turner let Bobby Green do all the things he wants to do with the slip and roll bollocks. And he just said, cool, I'm going to double jab you and then hit you when you're leaning. And smoked him. Anyway, back to focus on Bahamondes. Awesome triangle. How often do you see these? He says there was a triangle armbar also on this card by Bruno Ferreira from the weirdest position. Not at all a clever setup. He just sort of fell into it while falling off the back trying to strangle Petrosian. But the triangle is so rare at the high levels now. I always use the stat that when Tony Ferguson beat Kevin Lee, when was that? 2018 maybe? For the UFC interim lightweight title. That was by triangle choke. That was the only triangle choke in the UFC that year. So they're not at all common. Very impressive by Bahamondes. I do like Bahamondes a lot. And he actually pulled guard in this fight too. He grabbed a single, Jalen Turner pulled him up off his hips and Bahamondes just went, okay, and fell in under him. So brave stuff to do that against, Jalen Turner hits hard on the ground and on the feet. What else did I enjoy? Carlos Leo got a win at last because he got absolutely robbed against Renat Fakhrenadov in his last one. Just beat the piss out of Alex Morono. His defense looked bad, I'll be honest. When he defends himself, he leans back like he's going, oh, don't touch me with that. But then he just swings back, and he's really powerful and really strong. I told you to watch him in the clinch because he beats people up in the clinch. Not enough good clinch strikers in this sport. Carlos Leon is one of them, one of the few good clinch strikers. And Morono, he's hurt, and he's just leaning on the fence, swinging back overhands. Like, he looked basically unconscious while swinging these overhands. Not the best, but yeah, he's getting on. I mean, how old is he? He used to be known for beating up old men, but he's only 34, but he's got a lot of miles on the clock. Bruno Ferreira had a messy ass fight with Armen Petrosian. I love this dude. He's just, I remember watching him against RoboCop and going, he shouldn't win this, and then he did. Like, this sloppy ass guy shouldn't be able to knock out RoboCop, and he's on the back foot the entire time, changing stances, and then he just goes wallop out of nowhere. Or Phil Hawes will always lose to worse fighters than him because he's so technically good, but he's got no chin. And that was another one where Bruno Ferreira was just looking bad the whole fight and then went, have this knee, and knocked him out. Funniest takedown you've ever seen. It was Brock Lesnar ducking his head and just running at the guy. Anything else good on this card? Joshua Van versus Ray Saria. I hyped this up. I was like, this could be sort of McGregor-Holloway type fight. Not in terms of where they'll go, but just that they're very gifted prospects who, if this were boxing, these guys wouldn't meet each other for years yet. But man, Van came out and blew Saria out of the water. Saria looked terrified. I saw someone say he had, it might be the boy Carl McLaughlin said Ray Saria has WMMA striking. This is one of those cases where the barrier for entry for striking is much lower. And by that, I don't mean that, obviously lots of terrible things can happen if you just try your hand at striking. But learning to wrestle is really, really hard. Learning to hit hard is not that hard, is not that difficult. If you can get to the point where you can throw hard and confidently and not be terrified, you can do a lot to set up your takedowns. What Ray Saria had going on in this fight was that he was clearly terrified to throw his own hands. And I think he's one of those fighters who, if he's against someone he can easily out-wrestle, he shows much better striking. His confidence was absolutely dinged here. The guys who do well as wrestlers in the MMA, if they can't round their games out, are guys who can bite down on their mouthpiece and just make it happen by striking badly with the opponent. If you strike badly with the opponent and you get hit a few times, you're still setting the expectation that the next time you step in, you're going to trade with him. Get him in a couple of trades, and then when you drop on his hips, it's going to be a lot easier to run through and finish. Though Saria did hit a beautiful over-shoulder drop Ippon Seoinage, where you drop to your knees and you do the cool judo throw over the top. I saw someone asking if this was the first one in the UFC, but obviously If you know your judo and you know your UFC, the boy Caro Parisian, this is so far back now that long-time listeners probably haven't seen Caro Parisian, but just go to YouTube, type in Caro Parisian, Karo, and then spell Parisian any way you like, and it'll probably correct you. But there will be whole highlights of his judo throws. He came up about the same time that Georges St. Pierre was coming up, so we're talking quite a long way back. But he had just beautiful judo. We talked about judo last week, and I said, there are these elite judoka who can never really apply it in MMA. It didn't seem to matter that he took the gi off. He just threw people with whatever he could get. And then in his post-fight interview, he'd go, "My judo throws are the best throws in the world. All the other judo throws are done by little girls." Which they should have used in like a Ronda Rousey hype package. What was the one they did for a pay-per-view where they had like young Ronda Rousey looking through the window of a judo dojo or whatever it was? That whole era was extremely cringe in MMA. Anything else good on this card? Undercard was fine. I'll talk about some of it on the Boycast, but I've gone quite long just raving about the good stuff on this card. And then, for a guy who's always negative, according to people grumbling on Twitter and Reddit, I think I spent a long time praising Ankalaev for a fight that everyone's mad about. But yeah, not too shabby. I'll be back next week. Sign up to the Patreon to get extra podcasts and articles. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and watch the Filthy Casuals Guide to Alex Pereira so that I feel motivated to make another one in a month or two. And be chill. The UFC's bum-ass gloves losing their logo before the Gaethje Fiziev fight. So that it looks like Gaethje's fighting with tampered gloves. And then they tried to get him to change them and he rightfully said, "Fuck off. I'm about to be in a fist fight. I don't have time for all this bollocks." Bless.